side. My name is Sergio Laguna. I'm the director of the Cuban Research Institute at FIU, which organizes tonight's event. And also I want to mention that we have the co-sponsorship of the Cuban-American Studies Association, which is an organization of Cuban-American students, both graduate and graduate here at FIU. And before I introduce our guest speaker, I want to mention that we have not one, not two, but 3 events tomorrow. So if you're interested, we have flyers out there for the 3 events. The next one will be right here tomorrow at noon on a lecture by Guillermo, who is with us tonight on the origins of the Cuban Revolution. And then also tomorrow night we're introducing Sergio Laguna's book as well as Guillermo's book. So it's going to be a marathon. But yeah, I'm sure you're going to be very interested.
I'm the opening act.
So, very pleased to introduce our guest speaker tonight, Dr. Sergio Laguna, who is an assistant professor of ethnicity, race, and migration, and American Studies at Yale University. And I believe, if I got it right from the internet, that you're still the director of undergraduate studies?
For American Studies.
For American Studies at Yale University. At Yale, he teaches courses on Latino cultures, literatures, and the intersections of race and comedy in popular culture, which I think is one of the topics he's going to be addressing today. He earned his PhD in American Literature from New York University, and also holds a BA in English from Montclair State University, New Jersey, which told me is very similar to FIU, that it's a commuter school, it's a public university. And I guess you also have a few Cubans there, right, in that area?
A couple.
He is the recipient of several fellowships, including the Cesar Chavez Predoctoral Fellowship from Dartmouth College, and has been a visiting scholar at the Human Heritage Collection, University of Miami Libraries. His interests, like his teaching interests as well, include transnational literature, Latino literatures and cultures, humor, performance studies, and of course Cuba and Cuban-American studies. He's the author of the recent book, which we're presenting tomorrow, Diversión, Play and Popular Culture in Cuban America, which I had the opportunity to read, and I think it's a very funny, a very serious book at the same time, so I'm sure this talk will reflect that. Very well written, well documented, so I really recommend it to you if you have a chance to read it. And there are flyers up front if you're interested in, and with discounts. In addition to his recent work, his recent book, he's also published in several academic journals like Latino Studies, the Journal of Latin American and Cultural Studies, and he has won on precisely this topic for his article, Guillermo Alvarez Guedes, Cuban Choteo and the Politics of Play, the 2012 article award from the Latino Studies section of the Latin American Studies Association, or LASA, and also another article of his on radio in Cuba, Miami, received an honorable mention for the Jack Rosenbaum Prize for the American Humor Studies Association. So it's great that you can study humor and make a living out of it, and I'm sure that it's a lot of fun doing that. Finally, he's also a frequent contributor as a public intellectual to periodical publications like the Diario de Cuba, Cuba Counterparts, the Miami Herald, the Washington Post, and he appears often as a commentator on CNN.com. So please help me welcome Sergio Laguna.
Thank you very much. Let me tell you, working on humor isn't as great as it sounds. You know, if you listen to the same joke 100 times, as I often have to, it gets less funny after a while, right? So I'll just put it that way. So thank you so much to Jorge for the invitation, to Mike Bustamante for aiding and abetting, and of course, Jaime Correa and Paola Salavarria. I was supposed to come in September. Actually, I came right before the hurricane, and I was able to escape right before the hurricane touched down. So Jaime and Paola have been really helpful in coordinating my travel. And it made me think of Alvarez Guedes' famous hurricane joke, right? Don't have time to play that, but I highly recommend you check it out, right? So my talk today draws from a chapter in my recently published book, Diversión, Play and Popular Culture in Cuban America, available for beach reading everywhere in Miami, right? The focus of this chapter I'm presenting from today is a man who likely needs no introduction, actor, filmmaker, radio personality, and novelist Guillermo Alvarez Guedes. A man who needs no introduction in the crowd, right? Guillermo Alvarez Guedes is near and dear to my heart because his comedy is actually how this entire book started, right? So in talking about Alvarez Guedes today, I also hope to give you a sense of what the broader book project is doing in case you can't make it to books and books tomorrow. But the main focus will be on Guillermo Alvarez Guedes. So when I say Alvarez Guedes, what comes to your minds? What do you think of? What's that? Mala palabra. Okay. What's that?
Sarcástico.
Sarcástico. ¿Qué más?
Great understanding of Cuban culture at the unique human level.
Beautifully said. That should go in my chapter. One of my chapters. Very cool.
Feel free to plagiarize.
Yeah. Okay. All right. I will. But it's on camera.
I will not expect
I'll
to
cite
check
it.
in the mail.
I'll get your name out and check. Yeah. Well. Who else? Anyone else? Anything else comes up when you think of Alvarez Guedes? Right? That's not a bad place to start, right?
Don't
Especially
assume
after
we
that
all are
last-
very familiar with him. Don't assume we're all very familiar with him.
That's what I will be giving an introduction, but some people, a lot of people are. So I will lay out some of the basics, right? So my plan today is actually, generally a bad idea. Is that we're going to listen to some jokes and then I'm going to dissect the jokes, that's bad. Anytime you dissect a joke, it turns out bad, right? But I'm going to do my best to make it funny, entertaining, engaging, right? Anytime you explain a joke, is that you run into the problem of potentially ruining it, but we're going to really try and stay away from that. But the focus today is to focus on jokes in the 70s and 80s, right? Miami was very different in the 70s and 80s. So by looking at these jokes from Alvarez Guedes in the 70s and 80s, I want to demonstrate how these things that just float around, these jokes, these cuentos, can tell us a lot about our everyday lives, tell us a lot about politics, about belonging, about the intellectual history of Cuba, and even life on the island today. So just from some cuentos and some jokes, I'm going to hit all of these different academic points, right? But for those of you who are not initiated in the world of Alvarez Guedes, I'll start with some brief biographical facts, right? Guillermo Alvarez Guedes got his start in the entertainment industry as a young man in Cuba. He was born in Unión de Reyes, Matanzas in 1927. He made his radio debut in 1949 on programs ranging from dramas to comedies. In 1951, he debuted the character that would make him famous in Cuba. El Borracho, I heard a couple people say it. Yeah, but you haven't seen his image though, right? So there he is, right? El Borracho, the drunk. And he performed this character on the nation's nascent television network, CMQ TV. Shortly after Fidel Castro rose to power in 1959, he left Cuba with his family for cities with large concentrations of Cuban exiles. He went to New York, Madrid, and Puerto Rico. He lived in Miami from 1961 to 1968 and settled permanently in the city in 1980. Though he performed in Miami throughout the 70s, he frequently traveled here to perform. Alvarez Guedes was a mainstay in exile entertainment for decades. He released over 32 stand-up comedy albums, 32. He published joke books and novels. That's one thing that people often don't know. He also published works of fiction, right? He starred in a number of television and film projects, right? Here are some of them. He also co-founded a music label called Tema Records that released the music of celebrated artists and groups such as Bebo Valdez, El Gran Combo de Puerto Rico, Celeste Mendoza, Elena Burke, and Chico O'Farrell. He was so popular in the 1980s that in 1983, he released a talking doll for sale. Yo, que muñeco. Does anyone remember this? Anyone remember this? Lily, you can take a picture with him after the lecture. So wait, we gotta see if he talks because 1983, tiene mía, ¿verdad? So let's see. Let's see if I get it. So if you hear that, no jodan más. Te voy a pedir una cosa finalmente. No, la mala palabra, ahí va, sí. Right, so 1983, the man had a dog, very popular, right? And you can take pictures with him afterwards, right? After the So that's how popular he was, right? So when he dies in 2013, at the age of 86, as some of you probably heard, tributes and commemorations poured in from the global Cuban diaspora, right? And his death took over the news cycle for days. It was a big event here in Miami, right? So why was Alvarez Guedes so popular, right? It's more than just the funny cuentos. Even in those early years of his career in exile, Alvarez Guedes was looked upon as a kind of model exile subject. His standing among the community is best summed up in an article written by Cristina Saralegui in 1976, way before El Show de Cristina, right? She wrote for the El Miami Herald, right? And she describes him in this feature article, quote, "Ahora Guillermo Alvarez Guedes es el típico cubano exiliado," right? So this idea of Alvarez Guedes, his status as un tipo típico, a Cuban everyman, is partially indebted to his politics, right? Which were in many ways in tune with what Lisandro Perez has called the exile ideology, right? The continued importance of politics in Cuba, anti-Castro politics, and support for the Republican Party. But more importantly, Alvarez Guedes reflected back what his audience wanted to see in itself. A wisecracking anti-communist with a magnetic affability who could take the turbulence of exile politics and life in Miami and use it as fodder for humor. My research has yet to turn up a negative review of his work. In fact, I argue that people wanted to like him and what his humor represented, an almost utopic narrative of a united exile community that people wanted to believe was possible. His stories about nosotros los cubanos were narratives of unity around the broad notion of Cubanidad and anti-Castro politics, which served as a welcome distraction from the very real tensions within the exile community, right? Especially in the 70s, 60s and 70s, right? And going to the 80s. And what were these tensions? Old grudges from Cuba, past and present political affiliations, disagreements about how best to bring about change on the island. These were some of the issues that divided the community from within. Disagreement and even violence among exiles convinced of their views as the best way forward for liberating Cuba were common. Alvarez Guedes' albums emphasized the common ground, right? Through shared Cuban cultural characteristics and focusing on los cubanos versus los americanos, right? And we'll talk a little bit about that in the clips I'm going to show. In short, Alvarez Guedes' performances and persona were powerful interlocking sites of identification for Cubans to looking to affirm their cultural identities outside the island in a way that put aside the tensions within the exile community in a Miami plagued by drug wars, a slumping economy, and anti-Cuban sentiment in the 1970s and 80s. Cubans did not support Alvarez Guedes just because he joked about life in Miami and Cuba. Equally important was his performance practice, right? La gracia, his way of joking, right? The way he tells a story, the specific words, the intonations, the accent, the gesticulation, right? All of this produces an effect on the audience, right? Part of his style, his humor, can be described as falling under the tradition of choteo. Now, choteo is a form of humor and mockery common among the masses and articulated through Cuban popular culture. According to Cuban cultural critic Jorge Mañach in his 1920 essay, Indagación de Choteo, choteo is a form of relation, typically Cuban form of relation, a way people engage with each other, a way of sociality, right? So this use of choteo, right, this critically ludic, comic perspective on authority, this irreverent manner that provides an alternative, critically comic perspective on peoples and events that are supposed to be taken seriously, right? All of this is useful for thinking about the tensions of Miami in the 70s and 80s in particular, right? So the familiarity of Alvarez Guedes' choteo then functions as a way to make the unfamiliar space of exile, right, legible, perhaps even bearable in everyday life, right? So you might be wondering, if Alvarez Guedes was so popular in the 1970s and 80s, how did I, a US-born Cuban-American who grew up in Union City at Norte, become acquainted with his work, right? So when I started my PhD program at NYU, I took a class on Cuba and Cuban America. So this is my first time ever learning about Cuba outside of my house. So I sit down and I start reading the scholarship on Cuban America. I started reading it, absorbing all this stuff, and I noticed there was a certain emotional quality to so much of this work, right? Exile was melancholia, exile was nostalgia, exile was pain, exile was bitterness. And this didn't quite line up with my experience. Yes, life in Union City, in Miami, wasn't a conga line down Calle Ocho or Bergen Line Avenue every day, right? But there was always pleasure and humor and jokes as part of that everyday experience, right? So I started looking for it and documenting it. And I started to realize that it was in fact everywhere, right? So this is another aspect that you see of Cuban America, right? So exile, anguish, melancholia, but also the anger, resentment. So in the national imaginary, a lot of my students, this is still the things that they'll come up with, like anti-Castro, anger, right? So the El Yang protest, the Los Van Gang protests in 1999, right? So I wanted to kind of see if there was something else going on here, right? And when I started looking, like I said, it was everywhere, right? So this is a newspaper, Kakarahikara. That's a great word. You should say that in the mirror in the morning, right? If you're in a bad mood. If your kid or your grandkid gets a new pet, call the pet Kakarahikara, right? So this is a newspaper published in 1897 in New York City by Cubans who were being persecuted by the Spanish who fled to New York. And Kakarahikara is a satirical publication, so you can't read it here, obviously, but they're making fun of the Spaniards, very sarcastically, satirically. And then you have political cartoons, a very long history of political cartoons in Cuba. So this is 1897 in New York City, right? This is an edition of Zigzag. Zigzag, right? So Zigzag was one of the most important satirical publication in Cuba, starting in the 30s, all the way up to shortly after the revolution, right? And at first, they were in support of the revolution, and you had this very positive political cartoon. But then they started publishing cartoons that were a little bit, let's say, critical of the government in Cuba. Fidel didn't like that, and all of a sudden they're on, most of them, some cartoonists stayed, but the heads of the head cartoonists get on a plane for Miami. And then Zigzag has a different kind of flair, right? So this is 1961, I believe, right? And Zigzag had a long, many of you might remember, Zigzag had a very long presence in Miami in the 60s and 70s. And it kind of went off and on and off again in the 80s, right? And Zigzag was one of many periodiquitos, right? Like Chispa, that were these comic newspapers in South Florida, but also circulated in New Jersey, in Los Angeles, in Chicago. And I found one that circulated in Wisconsin. Someone's addressed in Wisconsin. So, and of course, theater. Theater, Miami. You know, the book on Miami theater, the history of Miami theater has yet to be written. It's one of the most vibrant theater cultures in Latino America, right? A number of theaters, and some of the most popular productions were comic productions, right? I've heard some people say Armando Roblan. Roblan was a famous impersonator of Fidel Castro, right? This is a show from the 80s, and then you have shows from the 90s, again, kind of translating contemporary moment into comedy, right? A Cuba me voy hoy mismo que se acabó el comunismo, right? So this is shortly after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the idea that eso se va a caer, right? Yeah. You have Que Pasa USA, the first bilingual show in the United States sitcom history that ran from 1977 to 1980, right? So these are all these examples. And during this search process, I eventually rediscovered Alvarez Guedes, right? And the word rediscover is important here, because I sit down in the library, again, maybe Jorge's jealous, I listened to 32 comedy albums, that was my research, right? To listen to all the Alvarez Guedes albums, right? And then I start noticing, like, I've heard so many of these jokes before, and it's because my family, they were stealing jokes from Alvarez Guedes and not citing Alvarez Guedes, right? The entire time, right? And this is part of kind of Cuban exile, kind of discourse in popular culture, where you tell a joke, you don't know it's from him, but it's from him, right? Where you use his jokes like, tú eres como el tipo del gato, right? You don't even know where that comes from, but you know what it is, right? It means like you're a pessimist, and if you haven't heard that joke, it's probably my favorite. You should listen to that one, right? Right, so rediscovering Alvarez Guedes led me down a rabbit hole that would eventually become this book, right? I started looking for other examples of comedy and humor. But it's not enough for an academic to say, okay, Cubans haven't, the comedy amongst Cubans hasn't been talked about. I'm gonna talk about funny Cubans. That's not enough, especially at the institution I'm at, right? So the question becomes, what can looking at humor tell us about social relations? What can it tell us about the history of the Cuban diaspora, right? So I use humor as a way to understand how the Cuban diaspora has changed over time, right? To examine generational and political tensions within the community, and to make sense of the racial and sexual politics also within the community, right? The Cuban diaspora has changed a great deal in the last 25 years in particular, right? Since the 1990s, well over 500,000 Cubans have arrived from the island, right? 40% of Cubans in the United States are US-born Cuban-Americans, right? So I use popular culture as a way to understand these changes, right? Because popular culture always has a finger on the pulse of the moment, the present day, right? If I make a joke about something that happened 5 years ago, It's not going to be as funny as I make a joke about something that is, happening in the political conversation today, right? So that's what I'm trying to do here. Use humor as a way to talk about the evolving complexity of Cuban diasporic political and social life, right? So the first chapter, just to quickly go through, is on Alvarez Guedes. I'm going to get back to him in a second. The second chapter looks at morning radio shows in Miami. So this is Joe Ferrero and Enrique Santos. You might know them better. They prank called Fidel Castro, right? That made a lot of noise here in Miami, right? Two US-born Cuban-Americans, and I used them to kind of understand like those shifting politics. So at the same time they were making prank calls to Fidel, they were also making prank calls to exiled political groups they saw as a bit too extreme. So they would prank call Vigía Mambisa, right? They would parody Radio Mambi, and they call it Radio Mani, right? So to show the kind of difference in politics, but also to talk about the shift in radio culture in Miami. Like radio has always been the medium of choice amongst Cubans in South Florida, but it's changed a lot in the last 20 years with big corporate conglomerates like Univision coming in and buying up the mom and pop radio stations. So Radio Mambi is now owned by Univision, right? I think that one of the last few locally owned Cuban radio stations is La Poderosa, right? I think that's the last one. So it's also a way to tell the story of Cuban Miami's evolving media landscape, right? The third chapter is blank, evidently. Don't know what happened there. Don't know what happened there. The slide disappeared. It's about the Cuban Nostalgia Fair. I don't know why it's missing, but Cuban Nostalgia. Go back. It's back? No. Step away. No, that's not it. That's another one. So the Cuban Nostalgia Fair, Tamiami Fairgrounds, right? It's been held every year since 1999, and I use that event to talk about how memory and nostalgia, right? How we remember and memorialize the past can tell us a great deal about the present and the future, right? So what is this event that is all about Cuba before the revolution tell us about Cuban Miami today, right? And I argue in this chapter that it's nostalgia for pre-Castro Cuba, but it's also a nostalgia for nostalgia. This idea that nostalgia could once bring everyone together. With Miami changing so much demographically and new Cubans arriving, not having the same investment in pre-Castro Cuba as people who've been here since the 60s and 70s, nostalgia has that power to bring people together, right? The fourth chapter looks at the movement of popular culture from Cuba to Miami and from Miami to Cuba, right? So there's been an increase of comedians who come to perform on television in Miami, right, in auditoriums. It's expanded incredibly in the last 10 years. This would have been unthinkable in the 1990s, right? Cuban comedians coming and performing on Miami television, hosting shows, completely unthinkable. So I use it to think about, again, the shifts in the political landscape, right? But you also have the movement of popular culture produced in Miami that goes to Cuba. So I don't know how many of you have heard of it, Paquete Semanal, which is basically the Cuban internet without the internet, right? So every week in Cuba, a terabyte of data is updated, right? With all movies, TV shows. Caso Cerrado is the #1 show in Cuba, right? People are in touch with what's happening, Game of Thrones, HBO shows, and also shows by Alexis Valdez when he was on TV, Carlos Otero, that make fun of the politics in Cuba are being shared on the island, hand to hand with hard drives, right? So on a copy of El Paquete that I have from 2015, there's an episode of Carlos Otero's show, TN3, and it's satirizing Fidel like all messed up, incoherent, right? Which, imagine that circulating in Cuba hand to hand, right, liberally. So I talk about that in chapter 4, and then chapter 5 talks about the life of Cubanidad online, right? So much of how we interact with each other is through social media, right? So I shouldn't have put this on before talking, because people are going to look at this, right? So this is a periódico Guamá by a Cuban cartoonist named Alain Lausang based in Chile. And he created a blog that basically parodies official Cuban government publications. So Granma becomes Guamá, right? And people share this stuff on Facebook, social media, right? Very, very popular. This is a good one, right? So
Very good.
but you also have people like Los Peachy Boys, right? Their videos have been viewed hundreds of millions of times. Literally hundreds of millions of times, right? And this US-born Cuban-American who actually has a puppet that's based on Alvarez Guedes. You can see the similarity, called Pepe Billete, right? So I use it to talk about how people are feeling and mediating Cubanness, right? In the 21st century on social media, right? So back to Alvarez Guedes. I'm happy to talk about any of this stuff, and just quick kind of pasadita after the talk, right? So back to Alvarez Guedes. Before I can get to him though, I got to give you some context, a little more context in the 70s and 80s to refresh your memories, right? Exiles arriving in the first two waves of migration from 1959 to 1974 enjoyed a largely warm welcome from the US government. Aside from hoping that the physical movement of so many Cubans would destabilize Castro's new government, the US held up the example of the exodus as proof of the evils and failures of communism. This helped to supplement the aggressive anti-communist messaging effort in the Americas during the Cold War. For these and other politically expedient reasons, Cubans were granted refugee status and received a number of benefits in the form of federal assistance. On the local level, Cubans received a great deal of support from the city of Miami. Bilingual education began in Dade County Public Schools in 1963, and metropolitan Dade County was declared officially bilingual and bicultural in 1973. The fact that this occurred is quite extraordinary, right? It helped facilitate to some degree the transition from Cuba to the United States. At the very least, the policies adopted in Miami were symbolic of a certain degree of cultural tolerance. But the welcome from the federal and local government did not always coincide with life on the ground. Local Miamians often resented Cubans for the financial assistance they received from the government and their boisterous behavior. That's the quote used in the news, right? Their boisterous behavior. In the 1960s, apartment buildings with no Cubans, no pets allowed were not uncommon. Adding to this resentment was the creation and sustainment of a Cuban ethnic enclave, which further reduced the pressure to assimilate, right? The frustrations of Los Americanos, as Alvarez Guedes referred to them, reached a boiling point in 1980 with the circumstances surrounding the Mariel crisis. The Miami Herald railed against President Carter's weak, undefined policy regarding Mariel and the exile community's desire to facilitate the exodus and subsequent resettlement of refugees in Miami. Editors at the paper used Castro's characterization of the Marielitos as social misfits to justify its aggressive stance toward the new arrivals and the exile community more broadly. Anti-Cuban sentiment was also amplified by the economic downturn Miami was experiencing. Also, the uptick in violence with the escalating drug wars and the wariness of yet another wave of Cubans adding to the already sizable population, right? With the anti-Cuban backlash in full swing, the modern English-only movement was born in Miami with an anti-bilingual referendum. So I always have to repeat this to my students, because they think Miami thinks Spanish. But the modern English-only movement was born in Miami. So this referendum was passed in November 1980, and the ordinance reversed policies of biculturalism and bilingualism in Dade County instituted in the early 1970s, right? So bilingual, bicultural Dade County is done away with in 1980, in large part as a response to what's seen as the quote-unquote Cuban takeover of the city. During this time, Alvarez Guedes performed regularly here, cementing his reputation as un tipo típico. Much of his comedic production during this time addressed the hot-button language issues, right? He always loved to talk about language and the general cultural clash underway in Miami, right? And as the inflammatory rhetoric in Miami against Cubans ratchets up, so did the tone and aggression of Alvarez Guedes' material. Okay, we're getting closer to the jokes, right? One of his most popular running gags were his clases de idioma cubano, right? And his first one was in 1974 when Miami was still officially a bilingual city. These albums always include the class last, because it's like, if you want to close strong, you want to finish strong, this is what you show, because it absolutely brings the house down, right? So this clip I'm going to play you is his first class, 1974, his second album, right? And I'm going to play it where he explains why we need these classes in the first place, right?
Miami ha sido declarada oficialmente ciudad bilingüe. Ya, los americanos lo han declarado oficialmente, pero yo creo que el bilingüismo existe nada más de parte nuestra, de parte de los cubanos, pues aquí hay que más y que menos se defiende en inglés. Pero de parte de los americanos no ocurre lo mismo, porque los pobres americanos, para encontrar entre ellos uno que hable dos palabritas en español es muy difícil. Entonces yo quisiera dedicar el próximo espacio de este disco a los americanos para darle una clase de idioma cubano. Porque esto del idioma es muy importante, ¿no? Para que nos acerque más a ellos, para comprendernos un poquito más, porque...
Okay, so, get into it. But he sets it up with a very important phrase, right? The key phrase in this little piece I played for you was se defiende, los cubanos se defienden, right? Which in English, idiomatically, if you translate it, means I get by. Me defiendo en inglés, I get by in English, right? But here, the verb defender takes on another meaning, right? In this class, and the jokes regarding language that I take up below, defense, defender, is always working as subtext. The use of choteo to narrate the politics of language in Miami amounts to a form of defense, defender, lo cubano, right? A community that feels a certain degree of vulnerability as a result of exilic displacement and the challenges posed by a socio-political landscape scripted in English. As the political tension in Miami mounts, the signification of defender in Alvarez Guedes' performances will shift to meet the escalation of anti-Cuban rhetoric, right? Alvarez Guedes' introduction to his Cuban language class sets up one of the defining features of choteo, described by Jorge Mañach, right? In his essay, he describes the playful point of view on the intractable realities of life as choteo's tendencia niveladora, is the leveling tendency, right? The ability to create a narrative of experience that levels or balances the uneven power dynamics of the social milieu through the language of choteo. Choteo subverts the dominant model of immigrant assimilation in the US by suggesting that Cubans are in a position to pity those poor Americans who cannot speak Spanish. Right? So if English is in power, right, in these performances, choteo becomes a way to level it. Spanish is right here, or actually a little bit higher, right? Instead of interpreting the decision to make the city of Miami officially bilingual as a benefit to Cubans, he understands it as an almost matter-of-fact, logical unfolding of events. Cubans se defienden in English, but now the Americans must fulfill the literal meaning of what it means to live in a bilingual city where everyone speaks two languages. In the narrative of the Cuban language class, the burden of cultural assimilation and understanding, usually carried by the incoming group, is transferred to the established community through choteo's leveling tendency, right? Once he has finished his intro, Alvarez Guedes begins his class by asking the audience to forgive him for speaking in English so the Americans can understand it, right? So we're gonna play the rest of it, and he's gonna teach some phrases. Bad word warning, we're gonna get some bad words here, right? So cover your ears if you're sensitive, okay?
Ahora voy a continuar hablando en inglés porque quiero darle una clase de idioma cubano a los americanos. Ok, perdónenme. Lesson number 1. In this lesson, I'm going to try to teach you how to pronounce two words that we Cubans use very often. These two words are the word mierda and the word come mierda. Suppose someone did something to you that you don't like. All you have to say is, no me hagas esa mierda. Now, if you are introduced to somebody and you don't like the person, you dislike the person, all you have to say is, ¿quién es este come mierda? Repeat, ¿quién es este come mierda?
So, of course, his audience is composed of Cubans who most comfortable in Spanish, right? But he's performing in English. But what he does by performing in English is reverse the classic teacher-student dynamic at work in the encounter between the native Miamian, in quotes, right, and the immigrant. Under this logic, the newly arrived must learn the language and customs of the U.S. with a certain amount of deference. That deference is not here, right? By putting himself in a position to teach Los Americanos, Alvarez Guedes reverses the logic of the dynamic by swinging the power into the hands of the Cubans, right? His English is accented but syntactically flawless as he explains the two words, right? That he will teach, mierda y come mierda. Teaching Cuban phrases that have a distinctively popular vulgar resonance to los Americanos, and equating them with English phrases makes the language of political power legible to those Cubans who feel intimidated by the privileged position of English at the time, right? Again, the leveling tendency, right? And what always strikes me about listening to this is how hard people are laughing, right? And you have to put yourself in that moment, right? So at that moment, there's these tensions going on, there's a very different political climate. Here, now, if you speak Spanish in the streets of Miami, if you speak English in certain places, people will look at you weird, right? But here, this is a different time, right? So it's also a release for the audience to hear these jokes, right? To equate English, to bring English from up here to down here, lo popular, right? Lo vulgar, with the Cuban bad words, is a way to leverage, level the power relations, right? As the years go by, Alvarez Guedes continues to release albums annually and remains committed to addressing the relationship between los Americanos and Miami's Cuban community. What changes is the boldness of the humor as the years pass, right? As we get to Miami, things ratchet up significantly, right? On Alvarez Guedes 11, recorded in the chaotic year of 1980, the tension of the anti-bilingual referendum combined with the fallout from the Mariel crisis spill onto the material of this album, right? Unlike the more covert aggression of teaching the bad words on Alvarez Guedes 2, the material on Alvarez Guedes 11 is much more aggressive in this contentious moment in the history of Miami. So he has a joke called De ayer a hoy, yesterday today. And again here he focuses on language. And the theme of reversal is again a big part of it. He suggests that the Americans are now trained and are accepting of Spanish, right? And he says now that we're on top, the Spanish speakers, we need to be even more aggressive. We need to double down. So I'm gonna play the clip here.
Y es que entre los cubanos que vienen de Mariel, entre los que vienen del norte huyendo del frío y entre los centro y sudamericanos que están constantemente llegando aquí, nosotros nos vamos a quedar con esto. Los pocos americanos que quedan aquí se van a tener que ir para el carajo. Le vamos a abrir un centro de relocalización por mandarlo para cualquier ciudad donde se hable inglés por ahí. Yo siempre digo que Miami no será perfecto hasta el día que un policía cubano agarre a un americano con una infracción de tránsito, se lo lleve a un juez cubano, y cuando el juez cubano le diga al americano, culpable o inocente, y el americano le diga, yo no hablar español, le diga, no habla español, pues para la escuelita, coño, 6 meses hasta que aprenda.
You have another, it's ratcheted up here, right? It's more aggressive in the context of 1980. And again, you have the leveling tendency, right? Putting the Cubans, here or actually up here, right? This kind of shifting the rhetoric of the power relations of Miami at that time, right? But at the same time, there's something else I hear in this joke, right? Alvarez Guedes and his audience are coming to grips with the reality of exile and the gradual loss of faith in the narrative of return, right? And every year that passes, the idea of going back to Cuba is further away. The inability to participate or contribute to the socio-political reality of life in Cuba necessitates a certain shift of psychic, social, and economic resources. Miami must become home. What cannot be done in Cuba will be attempted here. Imagining Miami through choteo is just one step towards making Miami home. Alvarez Guedes' choteo functions as a way to Cubanize Miami at a moment when los Americanos were mobilizing politically and socially to prevent just that anti-bilingual referendum. With the subversive, humorous perspective, the struggles that arise out of dealing with a now hostile establishment in Miami can be confronted through a comic lens that produces pleasure, if only temporarily, within the context of Alvarez Guedes' performance, right? And I just want to quickly point out one more album here that you should all check out, that is his most famous. This album sold better than any other of his albums. Actually, it sold more copies than all of his other albums combined, right? And this album, talk about defender, right? How to defend yourself from the Cubans, how things have changed from 1974 to 1982. Now the Americans have to defend themselves from the Cubans, 1982. What's interesting about this album, performed entirely in English, right? And here, the message is, to me, mastery. How hard is it to tell a joke in one's native tongue? it's hard, right? It's hard to tell a joke and see that it's funny, right? I run into that problem all the time, right? But trying to be funny in another language, that's not your own language, right? Incredibly difficult. So that's what he's able to achieve on this language, to be funny in both languages. On this album, to be funny in both languages. People ask, like, where do you learn English? And before the revolution, Alvarez Guedes spent time in New York, right? Working in the restaurant business, taking classes and taking English classes, until he was eventually, he had to leave because of immigration problems. He had to go back to Cuba, right? But on this album, he performs this kind of mastery, right? To an audience, a Cuban audience, that understands his jokes, right? So again, it's not only his mastery, it's the mastery of the audience that's able to understand as he moves into the language they're supposed to learn, right? So, I just want to finish this last bit here, just to sum up. Alvarez Guedes' choteo and unmistakable popularity provide a means for understanding the ways in which the exile community narrated itself for itself during the tumultuous 1970s and 80s. These jokes provide that everyday texture. They are samples of those mini narratives that are so memorable, reproduced, and repeated in everyday interactions that help structure how we engage with one another and draw boundaries within and outside the community. Outside the island, that physical repository of Cubanidad, exiles became powerfully invested in celebrating all things Cuban in order to make sense of the displacement and the disorientation of exile. In Alvarez Guedes, they found their Típico, who possessed the qualities people wanted to see in themselves and each other, right? And as a postscript, I want to talk a little bit about the afterlives of Alvarez Guedes, right? Despite reaching the height of his popularity in the 1980s, Alvarez Guedes remained active in the entertainment industry until his death in 2013. In Miami, where the comedian spent most of his life, his death took over the news cycle for days, right, as I discussed earlier. Much of the coverage about his death focused on the impact in Miami. But I also want to end this talk by talking about the effect in Cuba, right? So in 2014, I was in Miramar in Cuba, and I went to a comedy performance doing research for the book. And the last joke was performed by Omar Franco. So he closed the entire performance, and the last joke he performed was about a Cuban man from Miami who goes to Pennsylvania in the winter to move. To live. Right? And the deer. Everyone loves the deer. Everyone always talks about it now, right? So, you know, the Cuban goes to Pennsylvania. It's told as a series of diary entries. And the Cuban in Pennsylvania is like, oh, this is so nice, the snow. But then things start going wrong, right? There's an accident involving the deer, right? And eventually he gets tired of the snow and moves back to Miami for the heat, hurricanes, and Cuban coffee, right? So I'm in Cuba watching this guy perform this joke. And the crowd was in stitches the entire time, right? And if audience reaction is an indication, he left the joke, the best joke, for last, right? Of course, it's an Alvarez Guedes joke,
yes, it is.
right? It's an Alvarez Guedes joke. And actually, if you do research, a lot of different comedians have a version of this joke for their countries, right? So I don't know which one came first, right? But Cubans know it as an Alvarez Guedes joke, right? And people were dying laughing. And this was not a one-off, right? People in Cuba know Alvarez Guedes' humor. So I want to play a video clip that speaks to that. I'm going to set the clip up here. When he died in 2013, a news magazine in Havana called On Cuba put together a tribute with the most famous comedians on the island, right? Basically talking about the importance of Alvarez Guedes in their lives, in their careers, right? So I want to play this for you.
Yo me enteré de la muerte de Alvarez Guedes por un amigo mío que está en Miami, me lo mandó a decir. Bueno, por aquí no me enteré, no hay ninguna noticia aquí del país de la muerte de Alvarez Guedes, ¿no? Otras cosas, como el líder de internet se sabe todo enseguida. Y yo creo que no lo que representa para mí Alvarez Guedes, sino lo que representa para todos los humoristas de este país Alvarez Guedes. Alvarez Guedes, en una oportunidad que tuve de conocerlo, que le pedí permiso para ir a su casa para conocerlo. Y yo creo que es una suerte haberlo conocido, no hace tanto. Posiblemente ha sido uno de los últimos que se ha entrevistado con Alvarez Guedes. La opinión que yo creo que deben tener los humoristas de Cuba es uno de los humoristas más naturales más carismáticos que ha tenido este país. Yo creo que no hayan 5 como él. Claro, porque después Maraca dicen que yo no conocía al maestro y vino de chocar estas 2 estrellas de Unión de Reyes. De Unión de Reyes. El talento interno bruto más importante de Unión de Reyes y el talento interno bruto más importante Maraca. Después de todo, los Beatles.
Cubano 100%. Un tipo muy simpático, muy querido ahí. A pesar de todos esos años que vivió en la ciudad de Miami. De hecho, sus anécdotas, sus últimas actuaciones, era siempre hablando de los cubanos, de cómo reaccionaban los cubanos en medio de Miami, cosas muy simpáticas.
Está comprando una casa que vale 2 millones de pesos, porque está frente al mar y que siempre ha querido vivir frente al mar. Pero la bodega más cercana la tengo como a 2 kilómetros ahí.
Le gustaba mucho hacer maldades. Cuando se juntaban, Ramón Veloz, el viejo Ramón Veloz, Alfredo Cataneo, que lamentablemente falleció hace unos días, y Alvarez Guedes, había que cogerle miedo. En una oportunidad, en una anécdota muy famosa, había un enanito en la televisión y ellos salían a hacer maldades y metían el enano para acá, pero el cómo fue que una vez lo emborracharon, lo desnudaron, le pusieron un pañal con un alfiler de criandera, eso se llamaba, y lo echaron en torno a la beneficencia, que era donde se depositaban los niños, que las madres que no tenían cómo mantenerlo, o que no lo querían sencillamente, y echaron. Aquello fue un rebolico, que eso, lo que se formó fue tremendo.
Aquí en los Estados Unidos, en las farmacias, lo mismo le venden a uno una prescripción, que le venden un sándwich, un café con leche, cualquier cosa. Y llega un tipo a una farmacia y le dice que está ahí, ¿ustedes hacen aquí análisis de orina? Y yo le digo, sí señor, y yo lávate la mano y un sándwich de jamón y queso.
Y eso siempre un humor para mí, un humor vernáculo, muy cubano, muy transparente, porque a veces utilizaba alguna mala palabra, pero yo creo que Alvarez Guedes es uno de los pocos humoristas cubanos que la mala palabra le quedaba bien, porque era una mala palabra que no era chocante, que iba con la intención que traía su cuento, era una mala palabra que está, para mí, está bien justificada, ¿no? Y no era que él abusaba de la mala palabra, sino que la ponía donde iba.
Bueno, así, muy criollo, confianza, muy criollo, muy mal hablado, vamos, se dice en la calle. Y Alvarez es uno de esos pocos humoristas que utilizaba, que se dio alguna que otra palabra esa en su chiste, y caía bien, caía simpático.
Dice, la familia, ¿qué tal? Dice, ay, más bien, todo el mundo va gordo, chico. Si ve a Elvirita, ha echado un culo.
Y los hacía de una forma que siempre era amor. Porque él le impartía una gracia a aquello. Cuando él hablaba de las cosas de los cubanos, cómo se comportaban los cubanos en un hospital, en esto, eso es una maravilla. Te tenías que reír de todas maneras. Y usando, yo soy enemigo de la mala palabra. Y yo le oía sus malas palabras y yo me reía. Con él no tenía problema. Había gente que yo le decía, le perdonaba la mala palabra a él y a Consolito Vidal.
El parador lo toca así por aquí y dice, señor, el mono se me metió en el chavo. Dice Teresa, no me lo sé, pero si me lo tararea te lo toco.
Alvarez Guedes es de los grandes humoristas que dio este país, pero él es como un ícono también de donde se enlaza lo cubano más genuino, lo identitario. Yo creo que él, como nadie, pudo captar esa esencia de cómo somos.
Cuando se recuerde a Cuba, cuando se recuerden las cosas de Cuba que solo pasan en Cuba y que solo conocemos los cubanos, siempre vendrá a la mente un chiste de Guillermo Alvarez Guedes.
Yo me encontré en una playa en Puerto Rico a una veterana cubana, amiga mía del teatro, que yo no la reconocí. Había rebajado 58 libras y de lejos me estaba haciendo así y yo lo que veía era un reguero de pellejo de nada. Después vino corriendo por el estado yo, parecía un aguamala corriendo por la arena.
Y sin duda es una pérdida que sienten todos los humoristas, ¿no? La gente que se dedica a este arte de hacer reír, porque sin duda, a pesar de que quizás en cuanto al estilo, en cuanto a la manera de asumir el humor, el único punto de contacto que teníamos era el de la cubanía, ¿no? Sí hay que decir que, en mi opinión, yo diría que él elevó el cuento popular de la calle, lo elevó a nivel artístico. Él logró llevarlo de una manera muy interesante.
Yo creo que por desgracia no tenemos información de esos grandes humoristas que abandonaron el país por problemas de ellos, porque quisieron ir a vivir a otro lugar, pero es bueno que aquí un día se pongan estas cosas, ¿no? Alvarez Guedes, de Leopoldo Fernández, de estos grandes humoristas que para saber el camino que deben de seguir el humor en Cuba, que un poco que se ha ido perdiendo esa línea vernácula, que es la línea del humor que siempre funcionó en este país, ¿no?
Sí, es muy lamentable que no se pudo ver jamás una actuación de Alvarez Guedes por razones políticas que todos conocemos. Yo creo que pasó un poco como con Sergio Laguna, que fueron pasando los años, nunca nos entendimos, parece. Aunque nuestra generación no lo conoció, pero sí siempre estuvo presente en cassettes que se pasaban de mano en mano, en discos, en libros, en videos. Y yo creo que eso fue importante porque siempre ha sido como un referente que estuvo ahí puntuando siempre en la carrera de muchos que hoy nos dedicamos al humor.
Otra cosa que quiere viajar, dice que vamos a ir 6 meses a Europa y 1 mes a la China. 6 meses a Europa, ¿para qué? Que las catedrales, que los castillos, que nos vamos a pasar 6 meses viendo piedra vieja por ahí.
Es una escuela a seguir. Yo estuve hablando con él casi un día y es una escuela a seguir porque son personas que en una hora te dan un background de trabajo de años.
Yo creo que es uno de esos artistas cubanos que la gente va a recordar siempre por eso, por su cubanía, por su criollismo, por su manera de asumir el humor de manera general.
Yo creo que sí ha sido una pérdida sensible para el humor cubano. Y cuando digo el humor cubano, tengo que decir el cubano, que es una sola. Este es el lugar del mundo donde esté un artista cubano, un artista cubano.
Ojalá, donde esté Guillermo Alvarez Guedes, se haya ido con la satisfacción de que la gente siempre lo recordará como un cubano alegre, como un cubano 100%.
Yo creo que es una figura capital del humor cubano y que no se puede escribir la historia del humor cubano sin contar con Guillermo Alvarez Guedes.
Un cubano, como decíamos nosotros, reyoyo, un cubano reyoyo, hasta la médula.
Okay, so I think it was important for me to play the entire clip, right? Because people often don't realize how much this stuff circulated on the island, right? And these are, again, I have to say, the most important figures in Cuban humor on the island today. They're not maybe so well known here, even though many of them have come to perform in Miami, but mostly engaged with people who have arrived since the 1990s. But it's just incredibly resonant, his work. And I went to a show for the first man who appeared, Antolino Pichon, right? A famous humorist. And I went to a show at the Miami-Dade County Auditorium, and he stopped in the middle to show the video of him with Alvarez Guedes. It was like Alvarez Guedes had like somehow conferred upon him that he was like official, right? And he played it for everyone in the audience to see. And viste que dijo, right? Like that he was like a big important comedian, right? So Alvarez Guedes was like so important, right? Like, giving the blessing to these comedians, right? And I have to say, most of this was filmed at El Centro Promotor del Humor. So in Cuba, there is an organization that sponsors humorists, right? State-sponsored humorists. So they are at El Centro en Verado, right? Creating this performance. Huh?
Sorry,
Right, exactly, right? Talking about, just like a little bit, not saying, oh, the Cuban government messed up by not allowing them, not playing them, but just saying, we should know about this stuff, it's too bad we don't see these performances here. We should learn more about it, right? Also hedging a bit, right, when it comes to, why did he leave? All, disagreements politically, right? They kind of downplay things. But the fact that they all took the initiative to do it, they didn't have to do this, right? They didn't get paid for this, right? They were just asked to share their thoughts on Alvarez Guedes, right? And it's not just comedians. Whenever I go to Cuba and people find out I have all the albums on a hard drive, people will follow me around asking to copy them all, right?
Can we copy this?
Can we copy it? Talk to me after the show. It's actually, I can tell a longer story about, it's a sadder story about where the money goes for purchasing these albums, but it's not going to the family, actually. There's some issues around copyright. It's complicated, unfortunately. Yeah, I remember going to Nueva Paz, Cuba, which is a very small town, right? And People were asking me for his albums and telling me jokes that they knew from his albums, right? So it's everywhere, right? For years, the popular narrative was that Cuba and its diaspora were divided by politics, the realities of the Cold War, and a dangerous stretch of water. What I began to realize in my work for this book was that although there were certainly divisions, obviously, there were also moments of great connection. Comedy was and continues to be one of the most vital examples of these connections. Today, those same comedians praising Alvarez Guedes in Cuba regularly come to Miami to perform in theaters and on television for Cuban audiences that remember them, and for those generations that arrived in the 60s, 70s, and 80s that never had the opportunity to see them on the island, obviously. Meanwhile, Alvarez Guedes' comedy continues to circulate, whether people know it or not, on and off the island in the everyday jokes and sayings people use to connect with each other and make sense of this complicated, ever-evolving Cubanidad. Thank you. I forgot this slide. This was Johnny Sanchez saying, delivering a